Hi, I'm Tawny Plattis, and you're listening to Dirty Bits, the podcast that explores the dirty bits of history your teacher probably left out. The term Comstockery was used by George Bernard Shaw in 1905 after Anthony Comstock, the United States postal inspector and Victorian morality-obsessed politician, felt the need to warn the New York City police of the content surrounding Shaw's play, Mrs. Warren's Profession. The play was about a former prostitute who goes on to operate a brothel while she attempts to come to terms with her own daughter's disapproval. Shaw said he wrote the play to draw attention to the truth that prostitution is caused not by female depravity, but simply by underpaying, undervaluing, and overworking women so shamefully that the poorest of them are forced to resort to prostitution to keep body and soul together. But Comstock thought of Shaw as an Irish smut dealer. Shaw once said of the term he seemed to popularize, "Comstockery is the world's standing joke at the expense of the United States. Europe likes to hear of such things. It confirms the deep-seated conviction of the old world that America is a provincial place, a second-rate country town civilization after all." Anthony Comstock was born in rural New Canaan, making his puritanical nonsense Connecticut's fault. His father was a farmer, and his mother was a devout Congregationalist, but she died when Comstock was only 10 years old, and the hell, fire, and brimstone that his mother so tenderly and lovingly raised him with remained with him all his life. His convictions were based on an unwavering belief that the devil's temptations were constant and all-knowing. Therefore, abstinence from all impure thoughts and behaviors was the only path to righteousness, clearly. He fought for the Union in the American Civil War, but was appalled at the profanity and widespread porn the soldiers circulated at an impressive pre-Snapchat age. The readily available adult content may have contributed to the tragic anti-porn movement that took the country by storm shortly thereafter. Comstock gets out of the Army and decides to move to New York City in pursuit of his fortune. He was absolutely flabbergasted at how commercialized the sex industry was, New York City being a far cry from his rural hometown in Connecticut. He saw people sharing porn, erotica, birth control, abortions, and prostitutes like Netflix passwords, and allegedly, in 1868, a very close friend of Comstock's was led down the devil's fiery path of moral destruction by masturbating to porn and contracting venereal disease. Those two things possibly being related. It's unclear in the sources I found, but we do know it was the dirty, dirty sex that did him in. And that was the last straw for Anthony Comstock. He said, "The mind must not be permitted to dwell for a moment upon improper subjects." He insisted, all reading and conversation must be of the most pure and elevating character. So Comstock takes action against the book dealer who he believed caused his friend's moral depravity. He brought the porn along with the police captain of the precinct to court as evidence in this lawsuit he's pursuing. He ends up having the book dealer arrested and all of his literary inventory seized. And the YMCA catches wind of this, up-and-coming, ball-busting party pooper, and they're super jazzed because the YMCA is also noticing people enjoying themselves, and they just can't stand for that bullshit. They have Comstock join, and they introduce him to other wealthy gentlemen who don't want anyone to have fun. He preys on their fears that their sweet, sweet children will be corrupted by the sexual deviance of society. And he presents this report that was put out by the YMCA called A Memorandum Respecting New York as a Field for Moral and Christian Effort Among Young Men. The motive behind the report was to use information from the census, tax data, and licensing reports to show that many of the younger members of society were spending way too much time playing pool, drinking, gambling, and sleeping with prostitutes. These patrons of Victorian morality gave Comstock financial aid and helped him to begin the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, the official morality police for the public. Comstock became a full-time agent of the organization, and later that year, he successfully influenced the United States Congress to pass the Comstock Law. The Comstock Law made it illegal to deliver any material deemed obscene, lewd, or lascivious, as well as banning any information related to abortion, birth control, and/or protection against STDs. This law included the power of search and seizure, so police officers could search for, seize, and take possession of such obscene and indecent books, papers, articles, and things. And then they could forward them to the district attorney. Any materials were destroyed if the suspect was found guilty. Comstock himself had the right to carry a weapon, and was able to obtain warrants for arrests, as well as confiscate and destroy any obscene materials. The issue with this was that Comstock took a very broad view on what might be considered obscene, lewd, or lascivious. He had the underlying American belief that contraception was lewd, immoral, and promoted promiscuity. In his mind, birth control was the gateway drug to rampant, unrestricted, societal, destroying promiscuity that would sink humanity into the depths of the great lakes of hell's fire. Not to be dramatic. He once asked in 1915, "Are we to have homes or brothels? Can't everybody, whether rich or poor, control themselves?" That was in 1915, so keep in mind, this viewpoint that you just heard is over 100 years old. He even took issue with some anatomy textbooks and wouldn't allow them to be sent to medical students by the post office. Many of Comstock's justification for his stern opposition to the joys of sex stemmed from what he believed would be the effects of erotica getting into the hands of the children. In fact, the initial morality bill was supported by Clinton L. Marion, who introduced it to the House of Representatives. Marion hyped up the idea that obscenity was the nation's largest threat to manhood, and all obscene material should be destroyed in the name of protecting the children. Comstock claimed that the country's schools and homes were morally bankrupt because of all the porn the kids these days had easy access to. He also argued that the obscene erotica would corrupt the sanctity of marriage and cause the church to become corrupted. So New York and the federal government gave him pretty much free rein to implement moral censorship for 42 years until he died in 1915. And Anthony Comstock was like the obscenity terminator, thinking of himself as the weeder in God's garden. He kicked off his first day on the job by beginning a campaign against the saloons in his New York neighborhood of Brooklyn, and shortly after was also involved in shutting down the notoriously corrupt Louisiana lottery, which was the only legal lottery in the United States at the time. The motivation to pass the Comstock Law was mostly inspired by the incredibly public and scandalous Beecher-Tilton scandal case. Basically, a well-known preacher, Henry Ward Beecher, the preacher Beecher, was sleeping with several women while publicly appearing to be just as uptight as Comstock and condemning anything that didn't fit his rigid, puritanical ideals. A journalist, Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for president, in addition to being an advocate for free love and who definitely needs her own episode, reported that the hypocritical pastor was specifically sleeping with Elizabeth Tilton. She was particularly irked at his infidelity because he publicly and loudly shamed her on a weekly basis for her outlandish and ridiculous belief in a woman actually having a choice as to whether or not she wanted to make love. Elizabeth's husband, Theodore Tilton, sued Preacher Beecher for criminal conversation, which meant adultery, and for the alienation of affections of Tilton's wife. The trial lasted 6 months, and 3 jurors voted against him, but 9 thought he was innocent. It was super salacious, scandalous, and appalled Anthony Comstock to such an extent that he immediately arrested Victoria on obscenity charges, all just for reporting on the incident. For 6 months, Comstock was obsessed with Victoria, possibly taking issue with the strong woman and wanting nothing more than to lock her up, he had her arrested 8 times, once even on election night, when Ulysses S. Grant won for the second time. Church-based groups wringing their hands at the degradation of public morality, of course, loved him, and civil lib groups absolutely hated him. Because of this extremism, Comstock had many enemies, and he suffered a severe blow to the head from an anonymous attacker that severely affected his health in his old age. The free love movement was the one group that did make sustained attempts to repeal the Comstock laws and were vocal opponents of his anti-sex movement. The free love movement believed the Comstock law embodied the sexual oppression of women. They said that the state and the church need to stay the hell out of the gynecology office, and they felt women were sexually enslaved by the institution of marriage. Because of all this, they became Comstock's #1 target, and he arrested several members over the years. And that group was just one of many. The prudish, mustachioed masturbator hater clashed with well-known abortionist Madame Restel. In 1878, he went undercover as a customer, seeking birth control for his wife. Being a good person, Restel provided him with pills, so he returned the next day and arrested her, which resulted in her committing suicide the next morning. But when people called him out on his fucked up methods, Comstock just goes, "Not one of my opponents has ever been near me or made a single inquiry at my office for facts. Without at least an attempt to get at the facts, they are not qualified to speak, and what they say should be viewed with suspicion and weighed with great care by thinking men. Thus is defined the true position of the opponents to the above law." There was also Ida Craddock, a belly-dancing hippie before her time, who believed she was married to and having sex with an angel husband named Soph, in addition to owning an office where she offered mystical sexual counseling to married couples. She was found guilty of distributing obscene materials, which were just tracts on human sexuality, again, for married couples. The night before she was supposed to appear at federal prison, she committed suicide, viewing her 5-year term at the age of 45 as a life sentence. Her last piece of writing ended up being a lengthy public suicide note in which she condemned Comstock for all his tomfuckery. He also had major beef with Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger. Comstock felt that these activists were becoming more and more brazen over the years in their efforts, and he was determined to keep the ankle-shaming Victorian morality alive and well. In her autobiography, Goldman referred to Comstock as the leader of America's moral eunuchs. Comstock arrested Margaret Sanger's husband in January of 1915 for distributing her book, Family Limitation. Margaret, a nurse, had written Family Limitation as a basic instruction manual for family planning after being horrified at the inhumane back-alley abortions she was witnessing in the city. Justice McInerney, at the September trial, said, "In my opinion, this book is contrary not only to the law of the state, but to the law of God. If some of these women who go around advocating women's suffrage would go around and advocate women having children, they would be rendering society a greater service." So Bill Sanger was convicted and spent 30 days in jail, and Comstock died shortly after that. Anthony Comstock destroyed 15 tons of books, 284,000 pounds of plates for printing objectionable books, and nearly 4 million pictures. He actually bragged that he was responsible for 4,000 arrests and gleefully took responsibility for 15 people committing suicide in what he said was his fight for the young. But Margaret Sanger was having none of this foolishness, and the moment he dies, she starts doing everything she possibly can to overthrow his laws. She opens the nation's first birth control clinic in New York and is immediately arrested for violating the Comstock law. But in 1918, the courts side with Sanger, and the women are allowed to use birth control, though only for therapeutic reasons, but it was a step in the right direction. Then in 1936, she pushed for a case that resulted in it being made legal to distribute birth control across state lines, and therefore making birth control legal to mail nationwide. Comstock presumably turned over in his grave as Sanger walked out of the court, pumping her fist in victorious slow motion. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or corrections for me, let me know in the comments section. Have a dirty day.